Hello and welcome. In this episode, I'm going to share some spine-chilling stories where people believe they encountered a Fleshgait. Fleshgait is a term for beings originally thought to be skinwalkers, but now is associated with Goatman. While it now refers to Goatmen, people still often refer to other beings as a Fleshgait, which you will soon discover. These stories include a young lady who believes a Fleshgait began following her after she saw it twice, a young man who has been stalked by something since early childhood, and 4 young men chased off a mountain by a strange creature. But first, we start with a story where a young woman and her boyfriend experience unsettling events while hiking in the UK. Also, if you'd like to help support the channel, click on the join button below. Alright, let's get into today's stories. The first story of this episode comes to us from a poster who experienced something terrifying while hiking with her boyfriend. They were in the woods and came across what she describes as a really cool lake up in some hills. While circling the lake, bizarre things started happening around her, then to her boyfriend. She does not say where exactly her story takes place, just that they live in the United Kingdom. As the original poster, or OP, and her boyfriend got to the lake, she decided to go for a swim while he continued up the trail to scout it out. The OP made her way down to the water's edge to have her swim when she saw a dead sheep lying there. There was also a horrible metallic smell she described as smelling like blood or rust coming from the bushes near the water. Her first thought was that the water had gone stagnant, but she does mention how clear it looked. Deciding to pass on her swim, she got dressed and returned to the trail to catch up with her boyfriend. However, as she made her way back to the trail and started walking down it, she noticed that the smell was still with her, even though she nor her clothes had gotten wet. There were times as she continued along that it was stronger than others, and sometimes so strong it almost made her gag. She says at these times it felt thick in her throat. But she continued on and endured it, climbing the ridge to see if she could spot her boyfriend and catch up with him to save him from having to walk back as originally planned when she decided to go for a swim. She looked down the path and could see some of it, but no one was on it. Being that they had gotten separated, she decided to stay in one spot and wait for him to come back down the path. But unfortunately, the smell had gotten so strong it was making her uncomfortable and she was starting to get antsy. She was able to wait for about 20 minutes before she gave up and started walking once again. There was only one path, so they would eventually run into each other. As she walked, she started yelling for him along the way. She would yell hello, then his name, along with where are you, in a sing-songy voice. And one other thing, that being, I didn't want to swim with a dead sheep. But there was no response to anything she yelled. She walked for about 10 more minutes and the path started getting very thin, but she thought she saw him just up ahead. She once again yelled and started walking faster, but there was just something about the woods that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. It made her want to catch up with him as soon as she possibly could. Then something happened that had her really freaking out. Off in the woods, really far off, she says, she heard someone shout hello, in the same exact tone she had earlier. Her first thought was that someone was following her, and that really worried her because she was so petite. She didn't want to run down the path though, because if she hurt herself, she'd be in an even worse position than she already was. So she walked as fast as she could while being careful on the rough terrain. About 5 minutes later, she then hears a voice yell out, "Where are you?" in the same exact sing-songy voice she had used earlier when calling for her boyfriend. Except it was kind of drawn out and sounded really far away. Eventually, she reached the bottom of the hills where the first trail split off. She was worried at this point because her boyfriend was still nowhere to be seen. She was also very freaked out by what she had heard before reaching that point on the trail and just wanted to go back to the car. There was a bench where she stopped, so she sat down to wait for a few minutes in case her boyfriend showed up. She didn't want to yell, but she did one more time, hoping to catch her boyfriend's attention so he could find her, this time screaming his name. Her plan was to return to the car to see if he had gone there if he did not show up. Instead, she began hearing something charging through the woods behind her, running down the hill through the trees very fast. Branches were snapping in the fast approaching ruckus. Her boyfriend then came busting out of the bushes, panting and out of breath. His first question was, "What are you doing down here?" He then told her he had been walking back up the trail to find her when he heard her shout "Hello" and "Where are you?" from within the woods. He walked off the trail and through the trees to where it sounded like she was and saw movement in the tree line ahead, with the sound of branches snapping. She was moving farther away from him and he was starting to get freaked out. He followed her to the next hill, which he crested while hearing her say the same things over and over. He finally shouted at her to come toward him, to which she would reply, "I didn't want to swim with a dead sheep." When he heard this, he immediately knew something was wrong because it was nonsensical and said in a very weird tone. It was almost like whatever was trying to reproduce her voice was practicing talking and drawing out the wrong syllables. This is when he heard her scream his name from the bottom of the hill in the opposite direction, and he knew something was off about what was happening, so he ran down the hill to find her. They made their way to their car as fast as they could, reaching it before dark, and they got out of there. Her boyfriend refused to talk about what happened from then on. The OP says her best guess was that something was trying to lure him deeper into the woods. Her best friend told her about Goatman and suggested she post her story online to ask if this could have been one. She says they've never even heard of Goatman in the UK and ends her post asking whoever reads it what they think. To me, this does indeed sound like a Goatman, especially with the smell she describes as smelling like rust and blood. This is common in Goatman stories. The mimicking and trying to lure someone farther into the forest fits as well. Goatmen are, like some other cryptids, expert mimics and can perfectly use someone's voice like in this story. How freaky it would be to hear something mimicking your own voice in the same tone as you just did minutes before off in the woods. Then only to find out that it was to lure your significant other deeper into the forest. I'm glad she screamed his name that one last time even though she didn't want to. It very well could have saved his life, and I feel like it definitely kept him from becoming a missing person. I've heard of Dogman in the UK as there are a lot of stories coming from there involving them. And I've also heard a lot coming from there involving mimics. Who's to say Goatman couldn't be there as well? Is someone from the UK who is listening care to shed some light on this one? Are there other stories similar to this with something trying to lure someone into the woods? Any urban legends or lore surrounding a being such as this? I'd be interested to hear if this is the case. What do you think about this one? And what do you think was trying to lure the OP's boyfriend into the woods? The next story comes from a young lady who posted her story online because she needs advice on a being she has seen twice and seems to have followed her to her home. This has left her wondering if she is in danger, so she has turned to the online community for help. She believes the creature to be a Fleshgait and describes it as a humanoid being. Where she lives on an Ojibwe reservation in a heavily forested area. The first time she saw this creature was one night when she was on her way home from visiting her grandparents. She was riding with her ex-boyfriend at the time when she saw something standing on the side of the road. At first it looked like a naked person with its back to the car, but the OP says the skin didn't look quite human, that it appeared to be buckskin. Whatever this thing was stood there unmoving as the couple drove past it and continued on their way home, both extremely freaked out by what they saw. After the sighting, they spoke about it on occasion, but they didn't see it after that. The second time she saw this being was right after she and her boyfriend broke up and he kicked her out. She was driving to her grandparents' house with her cats and all her belongings packed in her car. Along the way, her headlights caught some eyes that reflected in the light. The OP's first thought was deer, so she slowed down. But what she saw was definitely not a deer. The being she saw was standing on two legs, was tall and muscular. It also had the same buckskin appearance as the thing she and her ex saw standing on the side of the road. She says there was no way this was a person, as she was in the middle of nowhere and it was freezing out. She ends her post by saying she is afraid it could recognize her and ask if anyone has experienced anything like this. She asks for advice and says she will follow all that she receives. But her story doesn't end there, as she responds to a commenter with something unsettling that happened to her while she was at home one evening when the sun was setting. She was on the phone with her ex's brother, who she says is very good with these things and was raised very traditionally. During her call, she walked outside. It was then that she started hearing rustling coming from the woods, followed by an eerie, broken whistle. She ends by saying she put out an offering of tobacco the following morning. Usually, if you ignore these beings and don't give them any attention, they will eventually lose interest and move on. Gifting is definitely a bad idea. I've heard way too many stories where this takes a sudden, very bad turn, especially if you stop. Plus, gifting will just keep it coming back for more, even if you stop, which is when bad things begin to happen. Do not gift with these beings. Do not engage with them, especially the ones that seem to have malicious intent like crawlers, wendigo, skinwalkers, goatmen, mimics, etc. I've heard stories of friendly Sasquatch and even friendly dogmen where families have interacted with them for years and even generations. But I'm still wary of the creatures in these stories because we don't know their true intentions, and it could take a very bad turn at any time. There is one instance that always sticks out to me where a woman was exchanging gifts with one or more Sasquatches, and when she stopped, the Sasquatches became very aggressive toward her home, and her property. I personally would highly recommend against gifting, but that could be just me. As for what this could be, I can't say for certain that this is a Fleshgait and or goatman. She did say during her second sighting that she thought it was a deer, which points to this creature having something antler or horn-like on its head. Perhaps this thing did have horns as she was trying to rationalize what she saw as being a deer. This happens a lot in these stories like this one, where people, subconsciously or not, think they see one thing when looking at something straight out of fiction. It could just be the brain trying to process what they are looking at. The whistling she heard at her home could be attributed to a goatman, but there are other cryptids who do this too. Whatever the case, no matter what she hears coming from the forest, I would strongly advise her not to go into the woods or towards the sounds. What do you think this creature could be? Fleshgait goatman or something else? And what advice would you pass along to the OP? The next story of this episode is definitely a bizarre and creepy tale. It comes to us from Indiana, where a young man believes he has been stalked by a Fleshgait throughout his entire life. He posted his story online seeking help from anyone who can give him advice on how to handle his situation. This is a bizarre story with a creature seemingly invading his thoughts before he sees it in real life, and is similar to some of the stories I've done where people see these beings in dreams before physically seeing them. The OP says he lived about 2 miles from a decent-sized town in a neighborhood surrounded by a golf course and miles of crop fields. Since a young age, the OP has had intrusive thoughts involving a dark gray figure that was very skinny and had long, sharp fingers. The figure would often make bets with the OP that revolved around him dying. But once the OP started getting older, he started physically seeing this strange figure in person. It would often be standing behind a tree or darting behind a bush with excruciating speed. Sometimes it would even charge at him. One night, while in his room, his dog became very agitated at something outside. The OP looked at his window to see the outline of something tall standing there tapping on the glass. For years, he had recurring nightmares where this figure chased him through caves, forests, and other locations. One night in 2020, the OP remembers it specifically because it was Black Friday. He was outside just before 4 a.m. heading to his friend's house when he heard his friend's voice call his name. He says it was clear as day and definitely his friend's voice. It was coming from the golf course or one of the fields of crops. Fear surged through him as he jumped back into his car and took off. He did some research online and thinks the thing that's stalking him could be a Fleshgait or something similar. So he posted his story with other Fleshgait stories in hopes someone could help him out, asking for ways to protect himself and reasons why it has been stalking him for such a long time. He ends his post by saying that this is not a hallucination and his family has no history of this. Also, this has never happened away from his childhood home. He has spent years away from that home living peacefully with absolutely no incidents, but once he returns, it starts happening again. This is a very freaky story to have something engaging with you and tormenting you since childhood. What he says at the end of his post about it only bothering him around this home makes me think it is either attached to the house, the land, or something in the home. I mentioned in my last video about objects being linked to evil or malicious spirits and demons. Perhaps that's what's happening here. I'm not sure about this figure being a Fleshgait, and I included it with other Fleshgait stories because that's where the OP posted it and what he believes it to be. As I said in the intro, people used to refer to skinwalkers as Fleshgaits, and it hasn't always been linked to Goatman. I'm actually leaning toward this thing being an evil spirit or even a demonic presence in and around the home. One person in the comments believes this is a tulpa, which is a being that has been brought into reality due to someone believing in it so strongly that they manifest it in the real world. However, it does display some cryptid-like behaviors, like peeking out from behind trees, running extremely fast, tapping on his window, and mimicking his friend's voice. There have even been cryptid stories where these beings alter and/or invade dreams like what sounds like is being done in this instance. And this isn't the first story I've heard or covered on this channel where someone sees a being in their thoughts or dreams before seeing it in real life. As for why it chose him, I think maybe because he was a child at the time and it saw him as vulnerable, perhaps even weak, being that he was so young. It also saw the fear it caused in him, and most of, if not all of these beings feed off fear and instilling it in us. What do you think this thing is? And why do you think it chose the OP? Also, any advice on how to get rid of it? The final story of this episode comes to us from western Colorado, where a young man and his friends had a terrifying experience while having a bonfire up in the mountains one night back in 2018. He does not say where exactly his story takes place, just that his hometown used to be Ute land before the Meeker massacre and the natives were forced from the land. There is a national forest near his hometown where local teenagers would hang out having bonfires, shooting targets, drinking, smoking, and doing other activities without fear of the police encroaching on their fun. He and his 3 friends were juniors in high school at the time of their encounter. They were enjoying a bonfire and a quiet night at their hangout spot. The OP had driven up there in his truck and describes the road leading to the area as being treacherous. It is apparently easy to get stuck in the mud and trees along the way. During the night, they started and continued hearing a noise that sounded like an owl hooting, but more like someone or something trying to impersonate an owl. To make the situation even weirder was the fact that owls were rare in that part of Colorado, according to the OP, due to the very dry climate. The climate was more conducive to vultures and mountain lions. Over the course of an hour, they heard the noise about 5 times, with it devolving from sounding like an owl hooting twice to a singular ooh that sounded more like that of a gorilla. They grew concerned by that point, and one of the OP's friends started mimicking the sound in a taunting manner back at whatever was making it. When he did this, the sound immediately answered by one that sounded like it was just on the other side of the tree line. The OP and his friends jumped up and bolted for his truck, piling in and getting out of there as fast as they could. The OP was driving with one friend riding shotgun and the other 2 in the bed of the truck, as he tried his best to navigate the washboard gravel road as fast as he could. During their descent off the mountain, they rounded a curve when the OP heard screaming coming from the bed of the truck as chaos broke out. His friend riding shotgun began freaking out at whatever was happening behind them, so the OP slammed on his brakes and looked in his rearview mirror. That's when he saw something he described as skinny, hairy, and humanoid dart across the road behind his truck with an arched back on all fours. He says there was no coordination to this thing's movement, as it looked like an old man attempting to bear crawl at double the speed of a normal human. He barely had any time to process what was happening as everyone was yelling at him to go. When they eventually made it off the mountain, his friends in the back of the truck were in a state of shock and refused to answer when the OP asked them what they saw. Instead, they just told him to get them the F out of there. Only after they got back to his friend's house did they feel comfortable saying what they saw. All three of his friends described the creature the same way. It was a humanoid creature running on all fours with inhuman speed, eyes staring directly at the truck as it darted across the road behind it. Two of his friends said it had really long, creepy-looking fingers. They could all three see the trees and foliage moving and shaking as this thing ran within the tree line trying to keep pace with the truck. The OP posted his story 4 years after it happened and says thinking about it that night still makes his hair stand on end. After their encounter, other bizarre things began happening in the national forest where they hung out, especially after nightfall. The weirdest and by far the creepiest thing they found was a beheaded goat with its legs sticking straight up in the air that had 6 equal slash marks on its stomach. The head was nowhere to be found. The OP moved away 3 years prior to his post, but even when he goes back to his hometown, he is creeped out. He also refuses to go into the forest after dark or even right before sunset. He asks that whoever reads his story let him know what they think. One commenter thinks the OP encountered a skinwalker, while another thinks it could have been a mountain man, giant, or Sasquatch. To me, though, it doesn't sound like any of these. For one, the beings mentioned by these commenters all move fluently when running, and skinwalkers look natural when running on all fours. I haven't heard of any stories where Sasquatch do this, as most are described as running on 2 legs. I guess it could be possible, them running on all fours, but usually when they give chase, they are running on 2 legs. The sound the OP describes as sounding like a gorilla is similar to what some describe as coming from a Sasquatch, but the creature described and how it was running on all fours and clumsily doesn't fit with a Sasquatch. Also, there is just something about their description of this thing that makes me think it's something else. However, I'm not really sure what this could have been and included it with other Fleshgait stories because that's where the OP posted it. The way he describes it running without coordination really throws me off here, as most cryptids who run on all fours are described as doing so very naturally, even if they look like a person while doing it. It could have been a skinwalker or Sasquatch, or even a crawler. I can't fully rule out Fleshgait Goatman either. Also, the beheaded goat they found sounds to me like it was sacrificed in some kind of satanic ritual, as they are pretty common deep in national forests. I've heard many stories from rangers detailing what they come across, and unfortunately, satanic rituals or sites where they have been conducted are part of what they see. What do you think this was that chased those boys off that mountain that night? And that's going to do it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed these stories. If you'd like to hear more stories like these and other types of cryptids, make sure to subscribe to the channel. If you want to send me your story, I'd love to read it. My email is wolfwhocriedcryptid@gmail.com. I will also put it in the description below. With your permission, I may want to use it in an episode. Even if you'd prefer that I didn't share your story on my channel and just want someone to listen, email me. We can privately talk about your encounter. And please remember to keep it civil in the comments section. No one deserves to be ridiculed whether they believe or not. Thank you for listening. I'll catch you at the next episode.